Good afternoon, everybody. And I thank ODI for bridging us together to share and exchange our ideas. I work in between researcher and grassroots networks and government departments, particularly on forest and environmental issues. And I will draw some of my insights on policy process, but primarily from environmental and forestry background. So I will basically discuss three areas: the political and research policy context in Nepal, and then I will bring two cases, one specific to forest policy process and one generally broad, where Nepal is these days undergoing through a political transition, and constitutional building process is the major political news from there. And finally, I will try to draw some opportunities and challenges based on those two cases. We have been undergoing, we had a decade-long Maoist conflict from mid-1990s till 2006. And then in 2006, we had a big successful people's movement, and that led to a peace agreement with the Maoist and other parties, or Maoist and the state. And also the peace agreement led to a demolition of 240 years of long monarchy. And then we went for election for the Constitutional Assembly, which is now drafting a new constitution these days. And there is a big discourse of New Nepal. In Nepali, it's a Naya Nepal and a New Nepal, which is basically to transform this poor mountainous country into a prosperous and democratic and inclusive country. And after the long Maoist conflict and after 2006 people's movement, because the country is socio-demographically very diverse in terms of ethnic minorities, in terms of caste, in terms of gender, very historically suppressed. So all these diverse minority groups found a time to express their concerns and their issues, particularly expecting that in the new constitution they will have a better position in terms of their representation and identity and everything. So in terms of particularly the policy process, and even that within the forest and environmental policy process, during the 2006 or slightly after that, the political leaders, the politicians, became much more powerful. But after 3 years, they are gradually relying now again to the bureaucracy for all these policy decisions. Forest sector, because we are still a predominantly agrarian country, so almost 2/3 of the farmer, they rely on integrated farming, where farm and forest and livestock, they are integrated much more. So the debate over forest management is primarily how to address the livelihood issues, how to address the issues of land access, land control, and also the economic interest, not so much of private corporate interest, but interest of the state itself to generate more revenue, and particularly the interest of the bureaucracy, forest bureaucracy, how to maintain the control over all the forests, and a lot of bribing and corruption goes on within the forest. And forestry sector is one of the most corrupted sector if you compare with other sectors. So the most powerful political leader will get forest ministry, and a young student, if you ask him or her, what is your vision? So to become a district forest officer, to make money from corruption. And apart from that, because we are in the foothills of the Himalayas, so we always have in a hot spot of environmental degradation and biodiversity degradation, and from the 60s onward, theories of Himalayan degradation, and so all these agenda, and also with the downstream relation with the Bangladesh and India, there is a huge interest on the environmental conservation of that region. So any of the local forest management agenda has to be within the broader framework of environmental sustainability of the region. Nowadays, people are saying we must have at least 40% forest land. So there is one lobby, and another is lobby on mining, particularly of stone gravel. and the struggle for land, because all land by definition which is not private land is under forest. So, any struggle for land is struggle against forestry. So, there are few actors who have their own stake in forest resources, and particularly important here is I am trying to differentiate the government with the bureaucracy, because the government, I mean here the political government, the cabinet or the political leadership, but it has usually different interests than the bureaucracy, which often controls the forest. And civic groups. In Nepal, one of the good thing with the forestry is we have very strong civic action in forestry. So, a lot of user groups, and they have their national federations. So, it's much influential in terms of influencing policy, in terms of shaping the forest governance, which is completely different from other sectors like education, health, or other areas. And donors and conservation agencies, they are quite strong because of the environmental interest in that region. So, all big conservation agencies, they are also influential actor in shaping forest policies. So, I have just tried to highlight some of their stated or hidden interest and their source of power. That is a kind of repetition. And what are the major policy issues within forest is the first, what kind of institutional modality should you have in place, particularly to manage the Tarai forest. The Tarai is the lowland, because in Nepal we have 3 different ecological regions: the Himalayas, the mid hills, and the Tarai, which is roughly 17% of the land, but it has a very good valuable forest. And up to now, the government has handed over the almost all the mid hill forest, but not the lowland valuable forest. So, the contestation is going on how best to manage the Tarai forest, because the government also has big eyes on it because of the economic value, and the communities want it from the government. One thing, we don't have any private forest, well, little bit in private farmland. So, almost all the forest is with the state, and roughly 25% of the forest is handed over to the communities. So, the conflict is between the state and the local communities. And the tenure security is always having a big issue, because though the state may handed over to the forest to the local communities, but it controls through different regulations that the communities are not free to, not autonomous to manage all these forests. They have a kind of use rights, but not the management kind of rights. And how to democratizing the policy process, because in 1957 we had all the forests nationalized, and for almost 35 years state managed all the forest, and gradually from late 80s it went to kind of devolution and decentralization programs, but it still controls over 78% of the forest. And even though that forest which is given to the communities is still controlled through different regulatory and trade barriers and all these things. So, how to provide tenure security to the local communities, that another issue. And increasingly these days climate change has become a strong issue, a dominant issue in terms of shaping forest policies, because the Nepalese government has recently received the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. So, under that it is going to have developed project to sell its carbon, which people suspect would undermine local communities' use rights again. And how to manage these forests for multiple benefits, not just for environmental purposes or just for government revenue. So, these are some of the issues where the different actors contest and struggle around forest policy. So, in terms of knowledge, existing knowledge in forestry, we have the bilateral or multilateral forestry projects evaluation reports. So, one of the best knowledge in terms of information at least is with these different kind of evaluation reports. They are with the ADB or World Bank or DFID or SDC or SNB. So, all these bilateral and multilateral projects, so they commission evaluation, and that is the best source of knowledge in forestry. Apart from that, we have students usually studying outside the country, either in the UK, US, or Australia, or somewhere in the Europe, and they do return back to Nepal for their field study. So the academic research from students for their master's or PhD degrees. Government also has government forestry department has also its research wing, but this is basically limited to biological research of some particular livestock species, wildlife species, or pasture species or something. And government sometimes occasionally forms different working groups, task force, commissions to address particular hot issue. Not always. Whenever there is a political crisis on that particular issue, then it forms some commissions, and the commission report are the other source of knowledge. And policy research itself is not adequate. It's recently started, so there are not well established organization to do policy research in forestry, and whatever research is on the is available on evaluation reports or academic research, that's all. So I am bringing two cases now. One case is with the forest sector restructuring task force. It was just after 2006 when we had a new government, democratic revolutionary government coming from the long democratic movement. So when the new minister came to opposing interest group, put pressure on him to have a new policy in Tarai in the valuable forest. So he could not resolve with that issue, and finally formed a task force. And the donors and professional groups and researchers who were looking for window of opportunity to work to provide feedback to the government, to provide input, to generate knowledge. So they worked hard and expanded the mandate of the task force to have a complete restructuring of forestry sector, and they worked hard with a massive consultation process across the country with a focus group, about 500 focus group in different parts of the country, and then a regional consultation meeting and national consultation meeting, and finally they produced a very good report, but finally the report is now within the ministry itself, and nobody is looking at it. And during the process, it took 1.5 years, and 3 ministers changed during that period, and now no one is interested to look into the report. And so some of the observation from the task force case. The task force was the part of the product of the political change, because even before that we had several problems in various issues of forest management, but we didn't have that kind of task force because it was a new government after the political change, after the political transition. So we got that task force. So it was a kind of opportunity created by the political change, by the political transition, but we could not materialize it. And the task force process provided space for researchers direct access to policy making process, because several researchers and forestry experts found their way up to the minister, up to the ministry, and then provided feedback, generate knowledge, and prepared that report. So we didn't have that kind of opportunity before the particular task force. So this is one of the good things with the task force process. And also donors who have been supporting in forest sector for long, they didn't have much space to influence the national policy. So this was the best option to involve in the policy process. But there were challenges, because the frequent change of the government and change of the minister, and sometimes from another party, that makes the ownership low, because the minister who started initially the process wasn't there when the report came. So that means the new minister did not have any interest to implement that, probably because he or his party wouldn't get much credit of that. And the second thing is, because the minister, they want to have this knowledge generated within a week or two, but the process takes time. So it took 1.5 years, and by the time there were several ministers and several governments changed. So the time span, the demand by the political leaders or the political parties, and the actual effort that can be put in and the knowledge can be produced varies. So there is a gap between the expectation and the supply of effort to produce the knowledge. So that gaps make it difficult to feed in policy process. With the forest sector, one of the good thing is at least in Nepal, we don't have much strong private sector involvement. So that makes policy relatively simple because there is government and local communities. So the combination is much clearer. And we have very strong civil society, and the civil society, what it does, because if you have good research going on, if you can produce knowledge, the civil society brings it up and translate it into as a policy demand. So the policy researchers, they themselves don't have to go through the different process of advocating policy change. The another challenge with the forest sector is some of the technical things, like particularly on the biodiversity and climate change thing. They are very hard and sometimes get time to translate into political language, the policy language. So the politician, they hardly understand the language of the foresters. The second case is with the constitutional assembly and constitutional building process. We have this constitutional assembly of 601 MPs this time, and they have several committees within the constitutional assembly. So the individual committee have CA members, roughly 40-50 CA members, and they have one secretariat, and they have government experts, permanent experts there, and some people invited outside from as expert. So these groups then can get feedback from nationwide consultation at local level from different parts of the country, and different interest group can go to and see the committee, and then they can present their cases there, or some interested group can organize a meeting and invite the MPs into their in their meetings, or even individual citizens can provide feedback. So there is variety of way through which we can inform the CA members, Constitutional Assembly members, and then they finally bring that to the large Constitutional Assembly. So this is the process. Within this process, there are opportunities that the researchers can have direct access to policy making, because before that we didn't have any chance that researchers can directly talk to policy makers, particularly the politicians. We used to have a conversation with the senior bureaucrats, but not with the politicians. Well, there were little opportunities that. And the second is because all the 601 MPs are new, and they don't have a good grasp of the national policy perspective, and they are now left with a hard job to draft a new constitution. So they are seeking more and more knowledge to become sure in that particular area, and they are really they very welcome to any experts or knowledge or research from any corner. But the problem is again the time frame. They need immediately now and here, and we can't provide that. And some of the problem, because the MPs they are the party representative, and they are quite ideologically driven, and they often seek to have their one supportive kind of knowledge, friendly knowledge. So they hardly value any neutral kind of knowledge. So some of the lessons, again the rapid and timely analysis is suitable in this context, in unstable politics and in changing political transition period. And from the task force we can see that the whole process generated the knowledge, but they didn't put enough effort to communicate with the politicians, either the ministry or other minister or political parties. So we need to think about that. And high level constitution limit the scope of research. For example, we have very hard dispute on land reform process now in the new constitution, whether we should be giving compensation to land, whether we should have a land reform program at all or not. So highly contested, and whatever research, whatever knowledge you bring, nobody will going to listen you, because they are very strongly positioned in their own locations. So in those contested areas, it's very hard for evidence to influence the policy. And bureaucrats' vested interest on forest leads to ignoring any evidence. So it's again economic interest of the bureaucrats in the Tarai, the valuable forest, that whatever the body of knowledge we can produce is having limited impact on that. And internationalization of agenda is helpful in bringing about policy change, particularly the securing tenure, forest tenure of the local communities, because some of the provisions like ILO 169, which provides enough rights to the indigenous and local communities, and again with Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, also provides adequate rights security to the local community. So these kind of international agenda and international convention have been helpful in securing people's access to forests. So sometimes when you can internationalize agenda, that will be much helpful in securing policy. I think that's all. This is Forest Action where I work for. Thank you.